Hello and welcome to our first episode of Murmurs on the Mooring, the Scottish traditional boat podcast. My name is Nell, and at the moment I'm working as a boat builder, but I still have lots to learn. And I'm making this podcast with Magnus, who's studying naval, maritime and coastal history. We're basically trying to bring stories from coastal communities which still continue to shape Scotland to how it is today, and most of these will be from a period that we might call the herring boom. So the 1800s, when ships became bigger, towns became more industrialised, and teams of people followed the boats all the way around the UK, working on the fishing. We grew up in the northeast of Scotland, and that's the unofficial starting point of our research and the podcast, which we hope will be for everyone. So, if there's any point in the podcast where we talk about something you don't understand or you haven't heard before, please contact us. It can be by email, which is below, or on social media, and we'll happily find other words or ways to talk about it. It's nice to all be on the same wave. In this first episode, you join us from Findhorn Bay, where around 30 sail wooden fishing boats were abandoned in the early 20th century. The boats represent the end of an era of the booming herring industry, and it's said they were abandoned in 1914. Some of the men who sailed them were lost in the First World War, not to return to their honest, beautiful vessels. However, there were greater economic and cultural shifts around this time in the Scottish fishing industries and in our coastal communities, which link this boat graveyard to the fast-changing world of the early 20th century. We'll explore this and why such beautiful boats have been abandoned to the waves.
There's curlews, there's gulls, and there's oiks, and lots of other things. And we're looking out on the bay from Culbin Forest, which is a really beautiful pine forest on the Moray coast of north of Scotland. We're here hopefully to talk about some really quite exciting boats.
Hello, the tide's really low at the moment. We've got a big wide open mud and sand estuary in front of us, and coming out of the edge of the water where we are ballast piles from the ballast of some old wooden boats that have been here, and we've got lines of frames sticking up a bit like the spine of an animal coming out of the sea further down the shore. And we're here because we've decided to record a podcast about boats.
Yeah, so I think we both really like boats. I certainly do. And I think this was the perfect place to start, really. Findhorn is pretty dear to both of our hearts, I think, as a place. And discovering that these boats were here really tied together our love of Findhorn and our interest in boats.
Yeah, and almost quite specifically in traditional boats. And here in the northeast we've got this amazing heritage of some of the most powerful boats that the UK had at the end of the sail fishing period. We don't see it chatted about very much, so we chat to each other quite a lot, and we thought finally, we could share this with more people.
Yeah, I think maybe it would give us a space to share that and talk to everyone about it, because otherwise it's the only thing that we end up talking about. So it'd be nice to have some new topics of conversation. But so these boats that we're looking at here are quite unique. There's not very many of these boats left. They're a class called the Zulu, and they were sort of the very pinnacle, the zenith of these big, powerful fishing boats that Nell just mentioned before. So, Nell, what would you say in your head as a Zulu?
So it's this boat that came about after we'd had a long time of a fairly stable two forms of fishing craft in Scotland that were very dictated by the Viking craft in their form. So when we imagine a Viking ship, we imagine maybe this curving, spooned bow, this tall stem, and on a Viking ship a dragon at the top. And on the Scottish version of this, the scaffy, it's so similar, it just doesn't have the dragon. And we have those long planks that fold over each other in what we call lapstrake or clinker building. And then the other boat that we have quite a lot of is the fifey. And this, throughout the 1800s, was a powerhouse for catching the herring and catching the whitefish, and also salmon. And then in about 1878, someone commissioned a boat that was going to be called a Zulu from Lossiemouth, and it combined the most powerful parts of these two boats, so the sharp breaking stern of the fifey, and then the very blunt and tall and the deep keel and the tall stem. Ooh, I just messed that up a bit. I said that the other way around.
That's
so
okay.
the raking the raking stern of the scaffy and the tall stem of the fifey. And when these were combined, they had a greater deck surface area for managing the nets on, and then the smaller hull and the smaller keel below, so you could fit more into a harbour alongside each other. Also less timber below, so in some ways cheaper to commission by the skippers of the area. Traditionally 2 masts with 2 huge lug rigs, 2 huge sails that would each be suspended by a wooden yard at the top, and no wood at the bottom in the way that we see a boom now on many of the triangular sailed sailing boats.
Yeah, I think that sums it up pretty well. I mean, it's
start.
it's pretty complicated, and we'll definitely get on to talking more about the different types and classes of boats that were commonly used around Scotland in this period. But I think the most important thing to realise is that the Zulu is the pinnacle. It's the last iteration of the sort of traditional Scottish fishing boat as it's seen in pop culture. So in the Silver Darlings, for example, that book that maybe some of you have read, the Zulu's mentioned a lot. And also just when you sort of picture a Scottish fishing boat, a lot of the iconography will be of a Zulu or a really large fifey. And to the untrained eye, they're broadly similar looking boats.
Yeah.
But here at Findhorn, there are the wrecks or abandonment of perhaps 20 to 30, maybe more, Zulu fishing boats. And they're all within a stretch of coastline that's maybe about 700-800 metres long. And we all know that they were abandoned. We know that they were abandoned at roughly the same time. They're between 35 and maybe as big as up to 65, 70 feet long. And they're really some of the last remaining evidence of this class of boat. There are 2 or 3 Zulus that still sail today. So you've got St. Vincent on the west coast, which is so is it a 47-foot?
Yeah, it's about that
boat. And then you've got Research, which is a class 1, the biggest class of Zulu, at the Scottish Fishery Museum in Anstruther. It unfortunately doesn't sail, but it's preserved there in the museum. And there are a few others. So one that Nell's got quite a close link with. And a few others that are sort of we don't know as much about because they've been converted into other vessels. So it's quite wonderful having this tangible link to something that's otherwise been quite forgotten.
Yeah, and all of these examples that we've just mentioned are actually very far from their birthplace. So it's nice to bring it back to this place where they were first being sailed and commissioned. I wondered if you're up for giving the rough measurements in metres.
In metres? Gosh.
Just for some of our other listeners.
I don't know how good my conversion brain is. 3 foot in a metre.
Yeah.
So if you've got a 50-foot boat, divide it by 3. So it would be about 20...
Yeah,
no,
be
a little bit. Yeah, about 22 metres, maybe slightly less than that. So about 20 odd metres, we'll say, for a 50-foot boat.
Yeah.
So.
And I think an 80-foot Zulu ends up being about 24 metres.
Okay.
long.
Okay. So, I mean, they're not small boats, and they were designed to catch a lot of herring very, very quickly, and that was what led partly to their need to be fast, to
Yeah,
be sturdy.
to quickly manoeuvre into these harbours here in the northeast.
Definitely.
It was a time when you got the most money for the fastest you brought your herring back. If you didn't bring them back within 24 hours of catching them, then you couldn't cure them and you couldn't get your income. But also you were pointing out that we've got lots of storms here in the Moray Firth. Do you want to describe that a wee bit?
So this particular coastline, and actually the whole of the sort of east coast of Scotland, is pretty unforgiving. And anybody that lives in Scotland, I'm sure, knows about the North Sea and how wild it can get. A lot of the harbours on this coast are small. They're often at the foot of cliffs or headlands, so they're quite sort of dictated by the geography and their size and shape. And that meant that you end up with this craft, this is designed, the Zulu, which is very specific to this niche. It's designed to be able to quickly evade storms if need be, and run basically for the coast. And they were so incredibly strong compared to other, well, not necessarily other vessels, but they were comparatively strong, so that they could weather pretty big seas if need be.
Yeah.
But the primary idea was definitely to outrun them if possible.
And to quickly get into our harbours, because here many of our harbours are man-made, unlike maybe the north coast of Brittany or around Cornwall. We've not got these small rocky headlands that you could hide behind to get some shelter, and not many natural shelters either. Apart from the one that we're in,
Yes.
which is Findhorn Bay.
Yeah, so the one that we're in, it wasn't actually used by a large fishing fleet, like a lot of the harbours and towns along this coast. So it's a large estuary with a big sort of bar in the middle, which is very tidal. So it wasn't really ideal for big boats to be navigating in and out of. It's a very narrow channel at the mouth of the bay, so it would have been navigationally really hard. So it's quite interesting that we've ended up with these boats here, and we know from some wonderful research which has been very recently carried out by Escape, which is a volunteer-run and led archaeological group that encourages coastal archaeological reporting and surveying in Scotland, that all of these Zulus were from towns further along the coast, so big fishing towns like Buckie, like Portsoy, like Banff. These boats were all registered to Buckie or Banff. There's a lot can be spoken about fishing boat registry. That's a whole other topic I'm not going to go into, but we know from the registration numbers of these boats that they were all local boats, but wouldn't have operated from Findhorn.
Yeah.
Yeah. So these boats were. We don't actually know a huge amount about these boats, and that's the slightly sad thing. We know roughly how big they were, and we know that they were all Zulus, as far as we can tell, from the really distinctive design that Nell mentioned earlier. But we don't know their names, really. We don't really know who owned them, who sailed them, and we don't really know precisely why they're here.
Yeah.
So we know that they were all abandoned roughly about 1914. Now, the historians amongst you might put two and two together and say that was obviously the year the Great War broke out in Europe, and that it would make sense for the boats to be abandoned if the crew had to volunteer or were conscripted to fight. But I think really it's a bit more nuanced and complicated than that.
Yeah. Yeah. Shall we just describe what we can infer from what's here right now?
Sure.
So what we can see is one way of telling that these are Zulus is that quite often we see the top of the edge of the deck kind of extends about a third beyond the length of the keel. And from this we can tell that it's a much shorter keel in proportion to deck than any other boat, and that puts us straight onto the Zulu decision. And that's backed up by photographical evidence of the boats here as they were decaying. There are photos throughout the years of the boats when when they were looking boat-shaped, going right down to now, which is when they look, very nondescript, and you really have to train your eye in a bit to see them.
Yeah, so something else that's quite helpful for identification is that there's these big cylindrical canisters sort of scattered around the beach, and they sort of are loosely maybe on top of rock piles. And it's pretty obvious that these are boilers, these are steam boilers. They're not particularly large, but they likely would have been used to power a capstan. And that points to these boats being Zulus, being from a later period, because obviously the evolution of steam power and reducing the size that boilers had to be really only came about in the latter stages of the 19th century. Yeah. So that's a pretty big giveaway, really, that what we're looking at is from that pretty specific period.
Yeah. Which is only really a period of about 30 years for the whole lifetime of a huge and beautiful and powerful vessel, to go from being commissioned to being potentially abandoned.
And I think that ties in really nicely as to maybe why they were abandoned. There was this incredibly quick technological shift from... The whole reason why we have Zulus is because technology was improving, and we had a better understanding of what makes a boat fast, what makes a boat, a good sea boat.
And we finally had very good fishing infrastructure. So we had train lines going straight to the ports. We had systematic teams of women going between all the towns, gutting these fish, a fish a second almost.
And I think the short time span that the Zulus were around is also itself reflective of these technological advancements, because even when the first Zulu was being built, steamships were being sailed all around the world, so their time was quite clearly limited. So steam drifters really began to take over around about the turn of the century, about 1900, and it was an exponential growth in the steam-powered fishing boat fleet that really was the death knell for the Zulu as a design. Who would want to go out fishing on an open-deck boat in the middle of winter, or whenever you were fishing in the North Sea, where you might be in 3-4 metre swell, when you could be cosy inside a potentially heated trawler? It's no comparison, really.
Well, but I imagine those engines in those early days being quite difficult to manage. A skipper was no longer a skipper, he was a driver, an engineer. I imagine it being a lot of hard work just below a deck compared to above a deck.
Absolutely, but I'd much rather be warm if I had to pick, to be honest. But yeah, I think that's why the Zulu is so captivating as well, is that it was such a fleeting moment in time that these boats sort of ruled the seas around the northeast of Scotland. Especially given that we, Nell mentioned right at the start that we had 200-300 years of pretty similar design leading to that, and then this was the moment when it all disappeared, really.
And so, if these boats were great and beautiful and efficient, and there was other technology, why do you think they didn't convert these boats or turn them into holiday yachts? Because that's probably a question a lot of people would like to ask if we describe something so well.
Yeah, so I posed this exact question to a really wonderful research assistant who's been sort of facilitated the archaeological surveys of these wrecks about 2 or 3 years ago. And she gave 2 or 3 really good answers. So the primary issue is cost. To convert a boat like a Zulu to steam power is an incredibly costly operation. Where the propeller would ordinarily have sat on a steam drifter would have required some pretty major modifications to the design of a Zulu to facilitate. Combined with that, you would have had to clear a lot of the hold space to put in a substantial steam boiler, which would sort of cut down on the amount of fish you'd be able to land.
Mm.
And also just, if you were a fisherman that wanted to stay with the times and wanted to be ahead of his competition, you would order a new boat. You'd want the very greatest and best in technology, rather than converting something that maybe only had a expected lifespan of 30 years. You want something new that will last you 30 more years. So that was the really good reasons that she gave, and I must say I can imagine that being really like a driving factor for these fishing skippers.
And so do you, I guess when we perceive these people, I admire these fishermen as very proud of their role. But I guess there's also this question that actually there are people working on the sea who, when they had the opportunity to work on the land, potentially would have been turning to that. Or this level of pride as well of being the skipper of your own boat, and then later on, with the advancement of technology, we had fewer but bigger boats where you're more likely to be an employee and not your own boss anymore. Do you think that could have played a role?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously when the war broke out in 1914, a lot of these fishermen, whether willingly or not, went off to fight. Many of them didn't come back. And when a lot of them came back, they maybe thought, I don't want this lifestyle anymore. You know, they've maybe come back from fighting in the trenches for 4 years and they want to do something else. So whether that's to buy their own boat, which at that point would be a steamboat, or a diesel boat, which were beginning to come in around about that period, or whether it was just to give up fishing completely. And we can see that a lot of sailors, a lot of these fishermen never returned to the sea after the war. They didn't feel as driven, as motivated to do that for whatever reason. But also I think it's important to recognise that the herring stocks had been in decline from about 1900, from what we can tell anyway. And so there was just less fish. So it wasn't as profitable as business as it had been, say, 10, 20 years before.
Truly, yeah.
And obviously having a bigger boat that can stay at sea for much longer is really the only way to make that profitable. And that would require less crew. And yeah, it was sort of, I guess, the first of a few moments for the sort of Scottish, and I think British fishing industry on the whole, when it was sort of, it was a big setback. And there were a few more setbacks in the 20th century that lead to the point we are now, where, you know, fishing in the UK it's a pretty minority industry, really, when you think about it. And I think this was maybe the start of that. There was a recognition that this wasn't going to last forever. There weren't going to be infinite fish in the sea. And now when you look at the amount of herring there are around the UK, it is deeply depressing. And these guys and their beautiful Zulus were at least partially responsible for that.
Yeah, but it is important to say actually the fishermen did have a quite strong awareness of the rate at which they were catching the fish, and they weren't necessarily the ones accelerating the industry to the same extent as government subsidy for commissioning a boat, the creation of railway lines going to each of the fishing ports, and like I say, this sort of land-based infrastructure that made it all possible to transport the curing. It was very systematic. It was based on a Dutch system and model that was greatly admired by the UK governments of the 1800s. And actually there were responses from Scottish fishermen at times when trawling came in, describing this as potentially disruptive, and now of course that's what many activists will think that fishermen don't know about or don't care about, which hasn't been true historically for a long time. Even there were disagreements over using a net over line fishing.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, nobody knows the sea better than a fisherman, right?
Yeah.
I mean, these guys knew every nook and cranny of the coast. They knew where bars were and weren't at certain times of the year. So I'd imagine when they were forced out of the industry, you know, even if it was their own choosing, I'm sure it wasn't completely willingly. It was giving up this sort of lifetime of learning of tradition, and for many of them it was family tradition. They would be all 7-8 times removed fishermen, you know. They would be,
especially here on the East Coast.
Yeah, definitely. Everyone they knew was a fisherman, so it must have been a pretty difficult time to navigate, I'm sure.
Yeah. So we've described the sort of cultural importance maybe of these boat wrecks in front of us and the story of them, but do you see this as a place that needs protection and that's got a place socially now that can tell us stories that are important to us?
I think absolutely. I think this location, and there's 2 or 3 others in the northeast of Scotland that we know of. So there's one at Embo, near Embo, at Lochfleet, which has also been surveyed, and it's revealed that there's up to about a dozen Zulus, as well as potentially other craft there, so maybe a couple of Scaffies and Baldies as well, but we don't know.
Yeah.
But also there's an as yet unreleased report that will be about a similar graveyard at Manlochie, which is in the Black Isle, which is to the north of here.
Right.
So there's 2 or 3 sites around, but they're still incredibly significant because they're not going to be here forever. I mean, we already just looking out here at the degradation of these wrecks, there's pretty few timbers really left, and they're going to disappear quite quickly through the sand shifting, the tide taking them away, and just the rotting of the wood.
Yeah, but that said, the wood's got incredible integrity. We've seen
Absolutely,
some very intact frames and stone posts and potentially a garboard just further down.
Yeah.
Where we were able to look at this small chisel mark and question whether it was a maker's mark. So the level of detail that's still held there is
Definitely.
a pretty nice piece of larch that they used, I think.
And I think that's why it's also worth preserving, or trying to preserve anyway, is because there's still something here. It's definitely worth saving because it's this link to this really specific time that actually, even though it was only 120 years ago, or even less, we don't know that much about. We know quite a lot about some aspects of it. So quite a lot of it's been kept alive in folk song, in some records that exist. But really, the fact that we can't identify these boats now is pretty telling to the fact that they've been forgotten to time.
Yeah.
And that's a shame. But I think it's wonderful that we now know that this exists. And it's really interesting to think about what might else exist out there.
Very much, because our paper record of primary sources in history is mostly harbour-based, from my understanding.
Yeah, very much so. So it sort of depends on what harbour you're looking at. It's very varied, and a lot of it comes down to the fishing boat register, which we're going to talk about a lot, I'm sure, over the coming, whenever we get around to talking about it. But these are basically a register of all the boats that are owned or registered in that port. And it's a list, and it will have a name, and it will have a length, and it will have a tonnage. And then it should have the owner as well.
Yeah.
Now, we still have a few of these. There's quite a lot still about, but unfortunately in the 1980s, there was a decision taken by way-ups to basically dump a lot of these original records when they were digitising it. And that's deeply unfortunate because a lot of really important information was lost. So on some ports, so like Wick, for example, in the archives there, they have an incredible, really pretty intact record of the vessels that operated in and out of Wick.
Yeah.
But some ports, like, I don't know, I don't know this for certain, but it could be, say, the White Hills, there's no record because it's very spotty. And that's really sad, actually. And it's possibly the reason why we've struggled to sort of get around to identifying these wrecks too.
Yeah, truly. I guess something that we can see in front of us right now are these piles of rock, which are the ballast piles that we mentioned earlier. They're clearly different from the rocks higher up on the beach here. They're larger, different stone, different classed size for the geographers and geologists out there, different angularity. And I guess this is also a record that shows us about the practicalities of sailing the boats. Now, I guess when we sail, it can be quite quiet, depending on your boat. But certainly we don't have the rumbling of rocks below deck as we tack and as we jibe. And these people possibly would have. But also, we don't have such adjustable ballast to the extent that these piles of rocks could be adjusted. So I wonder if you could go around all of them and see if the rocks were different and picked up in different places, and if the sailors were adjusting those while they were following the herring. Yeah,
I think you definitely could. It's been sort of mentioned that, it was mentioned to me anyway, that you definitely could, and you could do sampling to work out exactly where those rocks came from.
Yeah.
But the chances are it won't be that interesting, unfortunately.
It might be it's the northeast of Scotland.
Genuinely, you might find in one boat a rock from Inverness, and then you might find a rock from Portsoy, and it doesn't really tell us a huge amount because of the regularity that they would have been chopping and changing ballast, and also whenever a boat was refurbished, say it was hauled up at Banff to do some work on it, just whatever stone was available would have been then thrown back on board the boat. So I don't think it's that useful in this circumstance. I know that ballast is an incredible way of identifying wrecks in deep water, especially more ocean-going craft, because it really does give you a great sense of where a boat comes from, especially as in a lot of cases it's the last remnant of a wreck. These weird stones that are out of place. Yeah.
And suspiciously boat-shaped.
Yeah, and suspiciously boat-shaped, yeah. But in this case, I think it's a bit disappointing.
Well, we've not spoken about this clinker Zulu stuff yet, and I would say the ballast is a little bit of an inroad to that.
Yeah, so I'm going to let Nell talk about the specifics, but generally there's two types of wreck here, and most of the boats that are here in Findhorn are Carvel-built Zulus, but there's one notable example that stands out, and that is that there's one pretty large clinker-built Zulu, and the ballast was removed from this boat before it was abandoned, probably because of a design quirk that Nell's going to talk about. But that makes it stand out, because all the other wrecks here have these huge butterfly pattern ballast piles that are sort of either side of the keel, where if you can imagine, it's sort of just spilling out as the timbers have sort of disintegrated.
So just to define those two terms, Carvel, to start with, is when the planks of the hull are flush with each other as they're being built. So you'd end up with the surface of the hull being quite smooth. You could run your hand over it. And then if we imagine the clinker-built Zulu, that's almost stitched together with rivets. So it's overlapping, still quite wide planks. But as these overlap, if you were to run your hand over it, it would feel like you're going over the sort of ridges and over the edge of each plank as you put your hand from bottom to top. And so the way that they are built does end up being different on the inside too, because the frames have a lot more structure on the Carvel-built boat. On that one, the planks are just really tacked to the frame, and the frame is holding all the structure. And on the clinker-built one, it's more like the outer part of the hull, which is stitched together, is the structure, and the internal frames can be lighter and can be smaller. They're perhaps less integral. So if you imagine all the ballast inside that, probably you're going to get more sagging, more asymmetry if you pull your boat out of the water for the winter. So you're going to take out the ballast to store the boat for the winter and then return it again. Whereas in our understanding of records, of photographs and of practices and in the oral history, that wasn't done so much with the Carvel-built Zulu.
No. Yeah, and I think it's interesting because it maybe tells us a story within a story that, although there's a clinker boat, and we're going to get really deep into clinker Carvel boats hopefully later down the line, because it's super interesting as an anomaly, but all of the boats that still have ballast piles remaining, or even the one that had it removed, it suggests that these boats weren't expected to be here for a very long time. So we know that Findhorn and other really sheltered bays like this were used as a spot to haul up in the off-season to do some maintenance, and also just to clear out harbour space. It was a lot of these boats outgrew the harbours that they were supposed to be based at.
So when in the winter they'd have pulled them out.
They would have pulled them out, and they would have done some repainting, maybe a little bit of sort of maintenance, as well as just preparing them for the season ahead. So maybe adding a couple of new gizmos that the skipper might have invested in. So maybe a boiler, for example. So we sort of understand that these boats will hold up, maybe with the hope of being reactivated at some point.
Right.
Maybe even just for the next season. and the next season just didn't come. So there's a great photograph, I think it's from about 1910, and there's about probably 50 or 60 masts that you can count of just boats all the way along the coast here at Findhorn, sorry. And so some of those boats probably are still the ones that we can see here, but not all of them are. Some of them were presumably brought back into service. Maybe they were sold. Maybe they served a bit longer. Who knows? But it's interesting that gives us a really sort of insight into maybe why they are here.
Yeah. If you were to make any guesses, I'm sorry, it's tempting to ask you. any other reasons that are in your head?
I think it's really
them being here.
I think it's probably cumulative. I was really guilty a couple of weeks ago of sort of being quite cynical and wanting it to be one reason why they were all abandoned here. And I think if you look at the graphs that trend about the Zulus being brought out of service in the 1910s, if you look at the decline of the herring, if you look at the increase in steam drifter numbers, and then the First World War, I think it was the perfect storm. I think it just happened that these boats were surplus to requirements for a number of reasons, and that's why they're still here. And then they were, maybe after the war, it's possible that a few of them were taken back into service, but maybe some of them were forgotten. Their owners died or moved on, bought a steam drifter, and then just abandoned it because they didn't want to have to deal with recycling it or whatever else. So I think I won't be drawn into giving one really interesting answer. It's not like it's not that simple, unfortunately, and that's something I'm finding with history. It's never simple. It's a complicated mess.
I think so. So, shall we look at wrapping up?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're going to go over a lot more of what we've spoken about today with regards to things like terminology, with regards to the Zulus, the different classes of boats, like we mentioned, like the scaffy, like the fifey, like the baldy. We're going to talk about all of that in the next podcast, hopefully.
Yeah.
Which will be really exciting, because I love getting into the nitty-gritties, which will be really good. Yeah,
lots of very boat-specific words in that one, I think.
Yeah, we'll try not to keep it dry. We'll try and make it somehow interesting. But I just would encourage everyone that's listening, or anyone who's listening, to get themselves down to Colburn Forest, have a look at these beautiful wrecks, what's left of them, and see what they can discover for themselves. I mean, even just now we were walking along the beach and we found what looked like a rudder post with a big hunk of wrought iron still attached to it, which is pretty amazing, really, and
also protected. We can't take it home with us.
No. As nice as it would look on the mantelpiece, it can't be grabbed, unfortunately. No. So these wrecks are protected. So if you do go and have a route around, try not to disturb anything too much, and definitely don't take anything with you.
Yeah. But also, looking at any local beach, you'll often find something of interest if you carefully get your eye in. And if you've not done that recently, I'm sure you'll remember the joy of the last time you did it.
Absolutely. And that's what that I mentioned Scape earlier on this year. That's what they're all about. So that it's looking at coastal history, something that's often quite unrecognised. We talk a lot about naval history and we talk about a lot of history on land, but the sort of in between, the intertidal zone that we're looking at now is often forgotten. It's difficult to access, and it's often hidden out of sight because of the sea. So definitely check out Scape's website. We're going to leave a few links to a few reports about this, as well as where we got some of our sources from.
Yeah, and links to existing Zulus as well.
Definitely, for you to all have a really good look at, if you can be bothered, and maybe get as enthused as we are.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for listening. This has been very exciting for us to record our voices for the first time together.
Yeah.
Besides some beautiful boats.
Yeah, I really hope you can hear the birds as well as we can, because it's been beautiful.